Welcome everybody to the December Ruby meetup. Hope everyone's doing well. I've got Andrew McCann and Andy Statistician with me today. So I'm going to just run through the quick introduction here before we get to Andrew's presentation. So your hosts, as usual, are myself and Andy Statistician. We are going to be with you as your sole hosts for the last time today for not just this year, but for the foreseeable future. We're going to be joining forces with the JavaScript meetup in January. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. We do still have our own website that's going to be just for us that talks about the events that we have and posts our videos from the past. You can go there at YEGRB.com. There's a contact form there if you need to get in touch with us for any reason. And you can also check all of our past events that are recorded there. That's not going to stop when we join forces with the JavaScript meetup. And you also have a few resources there if you're just learning Ruby and need a good starting point. We are part of the Dev Edmonton Society, and we have a Slack channel, which is a great place to go to meet people, not just in the Ruby community, but in the programming community in Edmonton at large. You can find an invite for yourself if you're not there already at yegrb.com/Slack. And our channel, there is hash #meetupruby, meetup-ruby. As part of the Dev Edmonton Society, we follow the same code of conduct as them and the rest of the meetups. But basically what it boils down to is be excellent to each other, make sure that everyone who joins the meetup feels as welcome as we hope we made you feel. If you want to see more about that, you can go to devedmonton.com and there should be a link there. So today we have a presentation, as I said up front, by Andrew McCann. He's been presenting for us before, and I believe it's been about 1.5 years since the last one, so awesome to see you back, Andrew. He's going to talk to us today about managing multiple databases in Rails 6, talking about the new tools that Rails 6 gives you and some alternatives for some things that it doesn't quite do yet. We have a little bit of Ruby news, kind of a light month, but we do have Ruby 3 coming. Again, it still should be coming out on December 25th. No news about that being postponed yet, and the track record is pretty decent for the Ruby team for releases, so hopefully everything goes well. And as I mentioned up top, we do have the next Ruby meetup, and the ones immediately to follow are going to be merged with Exchange.js. So we're going to be shifting from a Saturday afternoon to a Thursday evening. It's going to be, I believe it is at 6 or 6:30. But we will have an official announcement for that in the Ruby meetup channel, of course, on our website and on meetup.com. It is going to be on Remo, so we're not going to have a live stream like we do right now. So if you do want to join, you'll have the opportunity to actually sit at virtual tables with us, watch the presentation, and then have a chat between discussions and presentations. So hopefully that's something that joining in with the Exchange.js group gives us a bigger kind of programmer community feel. And hopefully that's something that everyone appreciates, because we're really excited about it. So we've got introductions. If anyone in the chat wants to introduce themselves as well. Myself, I am Kelsey Gabriel, and my holiday season comfort food, recently I've actually been really into pork gyoza, so I've just been eating those like crazy. And I think that's probably going to be like my go-to this holiday season. So Andy, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you've been, or what you're excited to indulge in this holiday season?
Well, I'm Andy Statistician. I'm one of the co-hosts. My holiday season comfort food. Oh, geez. It's got to be shortbread cookies. I mean, that's it, right? You know, homemade, of course.
Yeah, I unfortunately don't have the opportunity to have those this year myself, because the family that I usually enjoy those with is apart. But I totally agree that yeah, okay. How about you, Andrew?
Yeah, Andrew McCann here. And Andy stole my favorite comfort food as well. I love shortbread. It's been a big thing in my family for years. My grandma used to make them all the time, and my mom and now my family.
Right on.
Yeah.
Okay, so we do have a quick job opportunity announcement here. So there's an opening at Vertical City, which is the company that both myself and Andrew work at. So I'm gonna push that to him because he is the development manager on that team. So he'd be able to talk about it in a little bit more detail. But if anyone else does know of anything, feel free to share it in the chat or go on the Ruby Meetup channel, and that's a great place to talk about it. And of course, the Dev Edmonton Slack does have an opportunities channel as well for any ongoing opportunities. So I'm going to go ahead and hand that to Andrew now and have him talk about first his job opportunity and then his feature presentation.
Sounds good. Thank you. So I'll start with the job opportunity. So Vertical City is currently looking for a senior software developer to join our team of, I think we're currently 6 developers. And you can join myself and Kelsey at Vertical City. So there's a posting on LinkedIn, and I'll make sure to drop it in the opportunities channel as well sometime today so that you can find the posting and apply if you're interested.
Sounds great. So I'm going to pull myself and Andy out of the chat for now. I'll pop in if anyone has any questions, but it's fully over to you.
Perfect. So I typically like to do presentations with a big interactive component. So if you do have any questions, it might be a little bit harder because we're doing this over a virtual Zoom with a little bit of delay, but I'll give a little bit of opportunity on every slide to ask questions. And if you do have any, please don't hesitate to ask them because I think that'll help everyone. All right, I'm going to get started with my contact details. So I'm Andrew McCann. I'm a software engineer and manager at Vertical City. My GitHub, which has very little on it of interest, but if you want to look at it, Andrew JD McCann. And you can get in touch with me either via the Dev Edmonton Slack or by emailing me at andrew@mccann.dev. So the first thing we're going to go over is a question that I'm sure a lot of people have, which is why would you need multiple databases in a single application? It's cool that Rails 6 provides it, but if there's no actual need for it, then it's not a super valuable feature. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking through some of the whys. When we're done the performance section, I'll be kind of asking you guys for some of the reasons that you can think of for why you might need multiple databases. So as we're going through this presentation, think about those and drop them in the chat. The first thing that popped into my mind and that I've seen across the internet is there's a lot of people that are trying to separate their databases logically. So if you have a blog site, they might separate out the blog, the posts, the comments, and all of that from the user database into 2 different databases rather than just 2 tables. I personally can't think of a great reason to do this other than if you're moving towards a microservice architecture and you want to have a user service at some point, separating out the databases could be a great first step. There's also potentially some performance boosts if you know that both of these databases are getting hit kind of equally and you want to spread that load over multiple machines. But generally speaking, I can't think of a great reason that this would be a valuable effort. But if anyone else can, I'm happy to be proven wrong. The next reason that I've heard of and been thinking a little bit about is security. So let's say that you're selling stock photos of dogs. You've built an entire website around this, and you also really, really don't trust Stripe for whatever reason. And you think processing credit card information yourself is the best way to do this. Your assets on the stock photo site, the prices, etc., all of that data doesn't really need to be secure. So there could be an argument made that you would want to store your credit card information in a separate database than the database that has all of your dog assets. The part that I struggle with a little bit here is that you're probably better off dropping all of that information into its own service that would provide you the most security for that data. But there could be use cases that aren't credit card information where a service maybe doesn't make sense, but you do have that differing amount of security needed for different pieces of data. And yeah, having multiple pieces of data in your more secure database will make it less secure. And the last one, and I think this is the one that is the most common and the biggest reason for wanting multiple databases in one application, and that is being able to improve the performance of your application. Typically, the way that you would do this, because most databases or most applications are very, very read heavy and writes are pretty minimal. So typically you would be able to scale your database by adding multiple read replicas of your primary write database. A read replica, for those that may not know, it basically gets all of the writes that happen to your primary database, but a few fractions of a second later than your actual database does. It's a completely separate database that just replicates all of the data and all of the changes that happen in your primary database and moves them into your read replica. So in order to improve performance, you can scale up those read replicas to 1, 5, 10, 100, based off of the scale of your application. And that's often a great way to make sure that you don't have to just add more and more resources to your primary database. One of the other things in the performance area that we'll talk about later, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now, is sharding. So when you don't have an application that's a lot more read heavy than anything else, then often what you'll want to do is do some kind of sharding in order to split up your primary database. And I'll dig into that a little bit further in a later slide. So now we're going to go back to the why. And yeah, I want to ask you guys, what are some of the reasons that you've seen or had a use case for multiple databases in one application? There might be a little bit of silence while the video propagates out. Okay, just going to confirm with Kelsey quickly that there are no questions or thoughts around this.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything yet.
Sounds good. I will move on then. Okay, so the next part of this is to talk a little bit about what Rails 6 is capable of and what it's missing. So it's not going to be able to do everything that we want it to do, but it does have a lot of cool functionality. And we'll talk through some of that functionality in detail now, and then we'll get into how to use it in the next section. So what are the capabilities of the Rails 6 multiple databases, the multiple database feature in Rails 6? It allows you to have multiple primary databases. So if you did want to separate your application logically, or for security reasons, it allows you to have as many primary databases as you want. For every primary database, it then allows you to have one read replica of that primary database. There's a little asterisk here, which I'll get into later. That one read replica could actually become multiple replicas, but I'll explain how that works later. The next thing that it does is it does automatic connection switching between primary databases really easily. So it effectively requires you to just make a few calls in your models, tell it what model or what database this model is connected to. And when you make those connections, it will just automatically switch between them every time you're using those models. It also allows automatic connection switching between your primary database and your replicas based off of what type of request is coming in. So it only allows this automatic switching from primary to replica in your controller logic, but it'll use the HTTP verbs to decide, okay, this is a post, so I'm going to write to the primary database. This is a get, so I'm going to write to the replica database. And it just does that for every HTTP verb. It also has all of the expected Rails DB tasks, and they work exactly as you would expect them to work.
I've got a question myself about that, Andrew. Sure. I notice one read replica per database. Is there a particular reason why that limitation?
Initially, that limitation exists because it's the easiest to build out. I'll get into it in a moment here about one of the other reasons, which is that the architecture behind having multiple read replicas, there's a great argument for that not living inside of an application.
Right.
That logic should live outside the application to the thing that you're connecting to, not inside the application.
Okay.
So what are the limitations? So what's still missing in Rails 6? The first one is sharding. So it doesn't support sharding natively or in an intuitive way. And I mentioned that I'll kind of quickly explain what sharding is. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail around sharding because that could be an entire presentation on its own. But the general idea of it is that you have large tables in your primary database, and you need to be able to scale the writes up into those tables horizontally. If you're going to do that, the best way to do it is to split up that table into multiple partitions. You can partition vertically, so you can take this table and just kind of split it out by column. Or the more common way of doing this is you partition it horizontally. So you take this database and you say that any customer ID less than 10 goes into database 1 or into this first partition of the database, and any IDs over 2 go into the second partition of this database. Those partitions could be a single database or multiple databases, depending on what your database supports, and they would often live on different hardware. So all of the assets in the first partition would live on a separate machine than all of the assets in the second partition. Sharding itself, while the idea is simple, execution of this is incredibly difficult, which is why it's not built in by default into Rails 6. But they are trying to look at how they could support it in Rails 6.1. And there is some active development work there. All right, moving on to the next limitation. So back to Kelsey's question from earlier, there's replica load balancing. So it's not supported in Rails 6. So the ability to have multiple replicas and balance the reads across all of them. And it may or may not be developed for Rails 6.1. They had initially kind of like scoped it in, and then there have been a few conversations around whether or not they should actually build this. The reasons against them building this at all kind of boil down to two things. One is that the infrastructure setup would have to be very prescriptive in order for them to do this for you. So they would have to tell you exactly how you have to set up your infrastructure and how all of your replicas behave and how they work, which isn't something that is necessarily a good idea. And yeah, there's also the side that even if you did it the way that Rails prescribed, it's probably not the right answer to the problem. And there are a lot of answers to the problem, but the general community believes that the right way to do this is to have a load balancer outside of your application that is connected to as if it were a database. And then that load balancer actually handles balancing the load across all of the read replicas. And I'll kind of explain that a little later. But in Rails 6, one of the things that it can't do right now is have multiple replicas and do load balancing on those replicas, at least not by default. The other thing it's not capable of doing is relationships across databases. Rails 6.1 is going to try and introduce a way of having a has many on one database that references a model that exists in a different database. The issue with this and why it wasn't initially developed is that it has to run multiple queries and then do the joins of those two of that relationship in memory. There's no way to do that with a single query, which is how most of these relationships were originally built out, is to just kind of be SQL proxies and they run a single query in the database you're connected to. So Rails 6.1 is trying to introduce that ability to do that in code, but it also has the implication that it will have to use a lot more resources than you would have to use if you were to do this in a single database, because you're going to have to run queries on both databases and join the results together. So yeah, those are some of the capabilities and limitations of Rails 6. I'm going to stop here again to provide the ability for anyone to ask questions if they have any. Probably a bit of an awkward delay as the video propagates across to YouTube.
So I do have a question about this. Did you get any impression when doing research on this particular feature, what sort of the motivation was for making it a priority for the next version of Rails?
For which limitation?
For the 6.1 starting to improve kind of the support for example, relationships across different databases, or potentially increasing the capabilities of the multiple database.
Right. So I think one of the reasons it is a priority is that there's things that people anticipate, especially relationships across databases. People expect that to work, and without a deep understanding of how databases really behave, it's not obvious why it wouldn't work. You have these two things in memory, and Rails has often strived for being as intuitive as possible. So if you try to do something, it'll just work the way you expect it to. And I think that's one of the reasons that the relationships across databases is something that they're pushing towards.
Even as a result, their performance could be potentially not as good.
Exactly. And then I think they're pushing more towards sharding support, because it sounds like they were trying to get that in for version 6, because sharding is one of the biggest ways that you can improve performance for write-heavy applications, but they just didn't have time to actually get it in for Rails 6. So they're going to try and get it in for Rails 6.1.
Is there anything about sharding support in particular that the sort of work that they've laid down already sort of helps pave a path toward? Yeah,
so most of the code that they wrote in order to connect to multiple databases will very quickly and easily lend itself towards sharding. I think the parts that are going to be a little bit more complicated is they're going to have to be a little bit prescriptive in how you do sharding and how Rails 6 supports that. Some databases support sharding just natively, and then you wouldn't really need Rails to handle that. So they're probably trying to figure out what is the right pattern for how sharding actually should work in Rails.
Right, and having a prescriptive like Rails way to do things isn't super unusual anyway.
No. Yeah, especially if it's not, unlike the replica load balancing, there's no argument that like doing this in your application layer is a bad thing. So if they're going to prescribe something, it's not really a problem if they believe in what they're prescribing.
Right. Cool.
Cool. All right, I will move on to the next section. So moving on to how does this work? So I'll go through a few different stages here. So the database configuration, how you set up the classes, migrations and scripts, and then how the database switches between, or the database connections switch between the different databases. So starting with the database configuration, this was pulled pretty liberally directly from the docs around building out multiple databases, but it's also pretty simple, so there's no reason for me to edit it. Your single database configuration looks identical to the way it did before. You have your name or your environment, and then all of the attributes of how you connect to the database in that environment. Multiple databases introduce another layer into the YAML keys, and that layer is around these different named databases in your environment. So production here has 3 named databases: primary, replica, and animals. And then it has the same attributes where you tell it how to connect to those databases, and it adds a couple more. So the replica attribute, I believe all that does is it ensures that replica is read-only. And it might have a little bit to do with how the automatic connection switching happens in the controller. But if you have your replica databases, you would just mark them as replicas. And then the animals database here is it's another primary database. It's another database that isn't a replica of this one. And for something like that, you need to tell it where to drop the migration files, which is a pretty simple, just here's the path that I want all of my Rails migrations generated into. All right, moving on to the class setup. So assuming you did have multiple primary databases, so like here we have a database named primary and a database named animals. For every model in your application, you need to tell it what database to connect to. So in this case, we have our application record, which is what the most of our databases or most of our models in our application are going to extend from. And it will connect to, when writing, to the primary database, and when reading, to the primary replica database. These keys in the database hash are known as roles. So it's the writing role and the reading role. That'll become important a little bit later, but it's just important to know now. And they're sort of done by convention. So you'll always have them as writing and reading if you want some of the automatic connection switching to happen as expected. The animal models would then follow a very similar pattern, but what they would probably do is have a separate base model. So something like animals record, and then you would change the primary database to be just animals. But it'll write and read from the animals database. That's how you would kind of set it up so that you have two base classes that you can extend from that will connect to very specific databases automatically anytime you use those models. Migrations and scripts, these work exactly as you would expect them to, or very closely to what you would expect. You can use all of the old db migrate, db create, db drop, etc. When you make the calls with just the way we used to do them with db migrate, what it'll do is it'll migrate all of the databases in your configuration, or it'll drop or create all of the databases in your configuration. If you want to perform an action against a specific database, so for example, I only want to migrate my Rails database, you would do db action and then specify the database as like a sub task. So db migrate animals. Same thing would work for create or drop or any of the other Rails db actions. How you actually generate a migration, all you really have to do here is make sure that you specify as a separate argument at the end what database you want the migration to be for. If you don't specify a database, I believe it will use convention to try and find the primary database and use that one as what it generates the migration for, but you're better off just specifying the database anytime you're generating a new migration. So moving on to how the database connection switching happens. So I'm only going to talk about how you would do this between your primary database and your read replicas and how you would switch between those, because switching between two different primary databases happens automatically all the time as long as you specify it in the model and you have that connects to in the model. So that you don't really need to think about, but how do you switch between your primary database and your replicas? And there's two ways of doing it. There is automatic connection switching and there's manual connection switching. So if we think back to what that code looked like in the model, we had connects to database and then these two roles, writing and reading. If you want to do manual connection switching and tell it which of these databases to use, by default, it'll use the writing one if you don't specify anything. Then you can call active record base, connect to role, and then tell it what the role is that you want to connect to. In this case, I wanted to connect to the reading database, and then I'm going to just put all of the code related to what I want to do on the read database into the block that I'm passing into this method. You would use this anytime that you're running code outside of a controller. So if this is in a delayed job, if this is in a sidekick job, if this is in a service that you have just kind of executing somewhere in the back end, you would have to use this because it doesn't have a way of knowing whether it should be connected to the reader or the writer by default. So you have to tell it which one you want to connect to. This code is also used in the controllers, but it's done automatically for you, and you don't have to do this. Anyone have any questions about kind of the manual connection switching, or do you have any thoughts, Kelsey? Okay, gonna move on then. All right, so moving on to the automatic connection switching. This is what's done automatically for you in controllers and only in controllers. You would configure it in your Rails configuration files, kind of like this. You provide it with a database resolver, which will allow it to decide which database to use in a given context. And then you provide it these two arguments. You have the resolver context and the database selector. The context and the selector allow Rails to do this here. So Rails guarantees that you'll always read your own write. So I'd said before that controllers will use HTTP verbs to decide whether to post or to get. One of the issues with that you often run into is that read replicas always have some kind of delay between when the data is written to the primary database and when they get that data. So if you do a post and then immediately do a get right after, there's a really good chance that you're going to get from the read database and it won't have the data that you just posted. So in order for Rails to guarantee that you will always read your own write, not you'll always read any write to the database, just the ones that you've done, it uses this resolver context. In this case, it will use the session to decide who you are. And then it will say that if you posted, like your session ID posted anytime in the last 2 seconds, then any gets that you have will go to the primary database instead of the replica. This delay is something that you have to configure. Generally speaking, you would try and find what is the highest replica delay of all of my replicas and set this value to that. So if all of your replicas always respond within a second, then mark this as 2 seconds. So if they always get the data from the primary within 1 second of it being written, give yourself a little bit of a buffer and make your delay 2 seconds. So then anytime within that 2 second window, if you do a post, the next get you have will come from your primary database instead of the replica. And that will guarantee that you'll always read your own write. One of the gotchas with this is that it's very easy to do database writes on GET requests. It's happened in almost every company I've worked at where, for whatever reason, we had something that wrote to the database on a GET request. And if you're trying to use this automatic connection switching, it's not going to behave as you expect if you're doing database writes on gets. One of the biggest reasons that I've seen before is usually adding some kind of metadata to a logging service or something else that's in your database. A good example that I heard yesterday was the idea that you have an object and you have a last viewed at time for that object. Often you'll do that because you have a GET request, and then you, during that GET request, you just update that last read at. And if you're doing that, then this automatic connection switching is not going to behave for you.
So I've got a question about this, Andrew.
Sure.
So totally understandable that it wouldn't, if you're connecting to the read database and you try and write something, it won't. So what does it do in that case? Does it just throw an exception, or what actually happens?
I'm actually not sure. I didn't really dig into it too deeply. I believe that it will throw an exception. But if it doesn't, then the most likely other behavior is that it will switch to the primary database, which that alone will also cause you issues. Like if you're doing this in order to get performance boosts, if you're always hitting your replica first, catching an exception, and then going to your primary, that's not going to provide you the performance boost, and it'll actually cost you in the long run.
Yeah, it'd be kind of interesting to add this expecting performance benefits and seeing the reverse.
Exactly. One way to like identify this, you can instrument some of the kind of active record models to kind of log somewhere if you ever see anything that resembles a like update call or a create call in your database and you're currently in a GET request. They're relatively easy to write. I don't have an example here, but I've seen them built out pretty quickly. Cool. So that's generally just how all of the capabilities that Rails 6 gives you for handling multiple databases and how you would set them up to work for you. All right, going to move on to the Replica load balancing side. So Rails 6 doesn't provide the ability to do Replica load balancing as part of its own internal tool set, but it does provide you tools that will allow you to do it yourself if you want to. I want to throw a few caveats in here. This is not production-ready code at all. There's a lot of potential issues that could come up with it. I've tested it to ensure that it has the behavior I expect, but I haven't checked to see if there's memory implications or connection pools that are becoming stale or anything like that. So use this code at your own risk, but it is code that is at least a good starting point if you want to do this in your application. Before I go into explain how to do this in your application, I'm going to quickly explain the right way to do this and one of the reasons why Rails isn't building this in by default. There's the typical way that you would want to do this is by having the load balancing of your replicas live outside of your application. So if you have your application up here at the top, this is all of your servers. They would have SQL connections that connect to some kind of load balancer. That load balancer would then look and balance the load across your different read replicas. This ensures that you don't have to release new Rails code as you introduce more replicas, and you can kind of do this load balancing and you can add replicas at will without the application needing to know how it works. This is also something that almost every cloud provider provides tutorials and very good tools in order to do very easily. So as long as you're using a cloud provider, this should be something that's pretty easy for you to do yourself and set up in a relatively short amount of time. This image itself, there's a link in the resources at the end to the article that this came from, but it's taken from the AWS docs explaining how to do replica load balancing. So that's the right way and the way that you should probably be doing this. But we don't live in a perfect world. We don't always have the option to do everything the right way. So I'm going to quickly go through how you would do this in your application code. So the first step is to set up your database or databases. So it looks very similar to what you saw before, where you have your primary database, and then you have several follower databases. So here I've kind of listed, we have 1 to 10 follower databases with their own connections. All of these follow this primary, and we want to load balance across all of them. So once you've done the setup and you have your YAML configured so that all of the databases are in it, we next have to create a database connector. So I decided to throw this into my application record as sort of a just class method that I could use. And it starts with just fetching your database config file. So active record.base resolve config4 connection, and then you give it a database name. It'll use that database name to look back at the setup or back at the original YAML file and find that database name in there, and then just pull out all of the settings. You take that config, which is now a hash of all of the settings for your database, and you try and look, or sorry, you don't actually do that yet. The next step is to grab a connection handler. So the connection handler is basically the context in which you want to run or establish your connections, and it handles setting up connection pooling based off of a key. In this case, we're using the database name as the key. So we pass in the database name. It'll try and find any connection handlers that already exist. If none exist, it will create one. So this is basically a singleton. Those database connection handlers, they are what have the connection pools to make sure that if you're running this code across multiple threads, you're always going to be fetching from the same connection pool, and you're not going to have to constantly recreate those connections. Once you have that handler and that connection pool all set up, your next step is to establish a connection with the database based off of the config. So once you've established that connection, it's pretty simple. You just execute the block that was passed into this method within the context of that handler that you created up here. You don't actually have to use the handler as an argument for this method. You just have to provide it the same key that you provided when you were doing the handler lookup. And then basically any code that is in this block will now get executed against the database that you specified. So once you have that and you have the ability to basically specify any database that you want to connect to and provide a block for it to execute in, doing the load balancing is very simple. I added just another method to this application record called connected to Replica, which takes in a block. The follower, then we generate a string for what the follower name will be randomly between follower 1 and follower 10. And then we just throw that symbol in here and say, I want to connect to that random follower database and execute this block of code. Yeah, so then outside of in your application, anywhere where you need to use that replica, you won't be able to do it automatically anymore in controllers. You're going to have to write this yourself and kind of wrap your controllers in this logic. But you can just say application record connected to replicas and then execute whatever your expensive read action was that you wanted to run against your replica database or your replica databases. So that's how you would do replica load balancing. Does anyone have any questions about, the approach to this, or any thoughts on why you might actually want to do this rather than what I have dubbed as the right way? But I can very easily be wrong.
I can't imagine it myself, but is there potentially a use case for prototyping or testing with a custom load balancer instead of a cloud service?
There probably is. Like I could see, like if you wanted to create your own load balancing code, there could be some value there. Yeah, I think I personally wouldn't, but that's mostly because I'm not an expert in the space. So I don't think I would do load balancing as well as someone who's has an expertise there. But you do have more application context than a general application would. So there could be reasons for that to be valuable.
That's true.
Cool. All right. Last slide here. Does anyone have any just general questions around anything I've said in my presentation?
Let's bring Andy in because he's been silenced this entire time. He's got anything he can bring up here?
No. I would have raised my hand, Kelsey, if there was anything. So I was very interesting to hear it through how they're handling it. I've dealt with replication in some applications, but not in a Rails app before. Yeah, and there's very many architectural approaches to doing it, and reasons, and so forth. And also it's something that most of the time you don't want to approach lightly. You got to think through what you're doing.
Yep.
Because it's very easy, unless you're looking at read replication, which is a standard pattern, right? You know, a star pattern where you have a single write database and then you have all your possibly multiple read databases. And you gotta understand your update patterns and stuff like that for doing it. But you know, you have to craft them given the needs of the situation, as opposed to it's probably something that you just don't go into off the top. You know, you know, your thoughts on sharding were also interesting, of course, because sharding can be really complex, and you can dig a really deep hole if you don't know what you're doing with sharding.
Yeah, it's one of those things that could provide you amazing performance boosts or make things significantly worse and paint you
exactly
in the future.
You know, there's in database circles, sharding is something that people recognize as something that must be there, and then tell you should never do it unless you know exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, there's also a really good reason why most databases are just exploring native sharding to that database now, where it's not an easy problem to solve at all.
No. And even in the top flight, what I'll call professional databases, that's not meant as a slant at MySQL or Postgres at all. I'm a particularly huge Postgres fan myself, but you know, I've spent literally decades working with oracles and UDB, DB2, and stuff like that, which are high-end commercial databases where the licensing alone, let me put it this way: one project that I'm involved with right now, the change of licensing based on the number of CPUs in the server on the Oracle databases is annually more than what most people would figure a data center would cost. Literally tens of millions of dollars. And you know, even with these databases, when you're talking about things like sharding and stuff like that, it's they'll often recommend that you bring in their professionals before you even consider doing something like that. So, but it is something when you need to get into things like that. It's definitely, you know, they can pay big benefits, particularly in the case of the splitting the read and the write databases.
Yeah.
Most people have, you know, don't realize, even in the case of most reporting and stuff like that, a lot of people, if they're running their data cubes and stuff like that for doing analytics, you know, that's typically one of the things that you do with it and so forth. So you can have multiple things like that. So.
Yeah, that's definitely the setup we have now at Vertical City, where all of our databases have a read follower, mostly so that if someone runs an expensive query, they don't take down production.
Yeah. One of the DBAs I worked with back in the day, he actually on the development databases put a trigger that if any query took longer than a set amount of time, it actually flagged something in the logs for him. So then he'd go and chase after the dev and say, what exactly are you trying to do here?
Nice.
Which was, well, this is, so that was actually on the provincial drug database. So the provincial drug database, there's approximately 5,000 dispenses. So 5,000 people get dispensed against a prescription on a daily basis. So you're growing by approximately 20 million rows a year, which was at least the growth rate back in the early 10s. Now that drug database has been going continuously. So you can imagine how large the database has gotten in that time. And so these sorts of things, you know, and there's additional things as well. So for instance, that database had a requirement of maintaining all history. So of course you never delete a record. right?
Yeah.
So even as you change, it's like, oh, it shouldn't have been this, right? As a matter of fact, you can't cancel a prescription, like delete a prescription after 24 hours. You just simply cancel it, right?
Yep.
Oh, I shouldn't have prescribed this. It just goes into the record because in case there's a dispense against anything like that, right?
Yeah.
So you actually had to maintain the version history of all the changes. You also actually had to also maintain audit logs of whoever had accessed the information because of the Health Information Act, right? So these databases would get huge, right? And so you're pushing those history things off onto additional, that's one of the areas where you do use, that's where the sharding was good, right? So you'd have your main database, which would have the current version of any record, and you also have reversions of that database, but then you had your history database, which was sharded, right? So you see, you need to understand the needs of the application when you come into these architectural designs.
Yeah. As a little bit of a plug for Vertical City, if anyone listening is interested in solving problems around large databases, one of our databases is currently growing by about 100 million rows a month.
Yeah.
And we have to perform large amounts of analytics on that data.
And that's sure to accelerate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the current, and it's been accelerating pretty drastically.
Yeah, one thing about this feature that they've added that I find simultaneously impressive and also, like, of course, like, it's very Railsy, is the automatic switching between the replica and the primary based on the context. And it is pretty simple. Like, if you look at the HTTP verb that is attached to the controller request, but it is kind of with that in mind. And of course, the caveat that you shouldn't put a database right in your index or your show. Do you think that it's wise for pretty much any project that's, for example, got the database hosted on the same machine as the application to just use that replica database because of kind of like the instant performance benefits you could get from that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in doing it. Like, if I were setting up a new Rails project today, I would probably set up both my writer and reader, just because with the tools Rails has provided, it makes that trivially easy to set up, and it will force you into good practices going forward, right? Like, not writing on GET requests is something that you're going to have to do because you've set up your database so that it can't work if you try it. So you have to have a best practice there. And then if your company does end up scaling to the point where they need these replicas, it can do it a lot quicker. And if it doesn't, then it didn't really cost you anything to get it set up that way. For
sure. Well, cool. While we wait for any potential last questions, I do want to mention again real quick that our next meetup is going to be on a Thursday with the JavaScript Exchange.js meetup. We're going to be kind of joining together to make a sort of Edmonton developer meetup, and hopefully have the opportunity for other meetups to join us as well. We're still looking for speakers for January and February, and we've got some interesting opportunities to do some collaboration with the with Exchange.js. For example, what we're looking at potentially doing in February is have a talk about a front-end application first on the JavaScript side, and then talk about building the API on the Rails side, for example. So that could be kind of an interesting crosstalk between the two. And in January, we'd like to do something kind of beginner focused. So if anyone has kind of something in the back of their minds, maybe want to do a reprisal of the infamous 2005 build a Rails blog in 15 minutes, something sort of thing, just to kind of lightly introduce us to the JavaScript community and maybe get other people interested, that'd be pretty cool. So come see us on the Dev Edmonton Slack in the Meetup Ruby channel. If you got any thoughts about that, you can see me at Kelsey Gabriel, I believe, or Andy at Andy Statistician, if for a direct message, if you want to just get in touch with us individually. But in case, or I guess if there's nothing else, that's it for the December meetup. Thank you again, Andrew, for coming with us. And yeah, we'll see you next time on Thursday.
Thanks all.